Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, NFV Migration, Pure Pragmatism or Pragmatic Purity, sponsored by One Access Networks. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can type your question into the Q&A box and submit your questions to our speakers. All questions will be saved, so if we don't get to answer you today, we may follow up via email. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any technical difficulties, please click on the yellow Help widget. Here you can find answers to common questions. A copy of today's slide deck is available for download in the green Resource List widget. Towards the end of today's presentation, we'll ask for your feedback. A survey will pop open on your screen and will only take 1 minute to complete. Your feedback is extremely helpful. Also, an on-demand version of the webcast will be available about 1 day after the event and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier today. I'd now like to turn the event over to Heavy Reading Senior Analyst Gabriel Brown. Gabriel?
Okay, thank you, Hannah, and hello, everybody. Welcome once again to today's webinar, NFV Migration, Pure Pragmatism or Pragmatic Purity, sponsored by One Access. I think the title of the session is reasonably easily understood, but the meaning, in fact, should become clearer as we go through. Really what we're talking about today is how operators can actually introduce NFV in practice into enterprise networks. The focus of the session is on virtual CPE for enterprise services, and obviously that's an important part of IPVPN and SD-WAN. We're going to be looking at a wide range of options available to operators in terms of CPE and vCPE types, and how these various different options map towards a kind of near-term pragmatic approach and also toward the longer-term ideals for NFV and hardware-independent networking. It's really an interesting and very relevant question for the industry as a whole and for enterprise service providers in particular. We hope you find the session informative and useful, and thank you all very much for attending and participating today. We very much appreciate that. My name is Gabriel Brown. I'm a senior analyst with Heavy Reading. Heavy Reading is an independent analyst research firm focused on service provider networking, and we're also the research division of lightreading.com. I'm also your moderator for today. Joining me as our expert guest speaker, we have Praveen Mirchandani, who is Chief Marketing Officer at One Access. One Access is a specialist supplier of CPE and vCPE products and actually counts some of the world's largest brand name operators as customers, both Europe and North America. Praveen's going to be able to share some very direct, very hands-on experience of what's actually happening in the market today and what he thinks will come to be over the next few years. So welcome, Praveen. Thanks for joining us. Could you just tell us a bit about yourself and what you do for One Access?
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel. Yeah, so as Gabriel said, my name is Praveen Mirchandani. So at One Access, I'm responsible for the product strategy and product portfolio, as well as overall corporate communications. My title is Chief Marketing Officer, but I've been talking virtualization so much in the last few months and years that I think I should actually change it to Chief Virtualization Officer. But more on that as we go forward. So let's take a look at One Access, because I guess for some of you, One Access may not be a name that trips off your tongue. We provide one-box solutions for enterprise services, and we target specifically service providers. And as Gabriel mentioned, 29 of the top 100 service providers around the world trust us to deliver enterprise services, both voice and data. We're a company based in France, and we have roughly 50% of our staff focused on research and development activities distributed across 3 main centers in the world, in France, in Belgium, and also in Bangalore, India. And what we're delivering today, and what we're going to focus on, is very much network functions delivered both physically and virtually, and the various deployment options that we can deliver and that operators are looking at as they move forward. So here's a quick agenda. I'll put some definition around these terms, pragmatism and purity. I'll take a look at the status of NFV at some of the major operators around the world. I'll talk mostly about Europe and North America, and then I'll dive into some of the CPE deployment models that were being considered by the operators. Some of the drivers and issues that are directing their choices in so doing. Then I'll take a look at some of the considerations for NFV migration, and there will be opportunity for Q&A during the course of this webinar. So pragmatism or purity. I think there are really two streams that one can look at when thinking about this topic. The first is the centralized deployment of virtualized network functions in a data center or usually in a distributed data center, super POPs if you like, around the edge of the operator's networks. And that's certainly been studied actively by many operators around the world. But another strand to the pure approach is to look at the deployment of white box CPE. As the name implies, these are boxes based on common off-the-shelf hardware, typically Intel x86 boxes, onto which there is a hosting platform onto which virtualized network functions can be dynamically loaded. A couple of comments about these two approaches before I look into some detail. Broadly, the centralized VNF approach is causing the operators a lot of headaches. Yeah, they still have to decide on the architecture for deployment, what goes where in the network, how it's distributed across their network. Complexity is another big issue. This is quite hard to do. Scalability, we'll talk a little bit about scalability later, but a lot of virtualized network functions are actually quite heavy in terms of their requirements for compute and memory and storage requirements. Another big issue is return on investment, as well as more of a cultural issue, which is how do they achieve a DevOps culture, which is really about merging the network of the IT functions within their organizations to be able to achieve virtualization and the tools and expertise to be able to do that. They're also facing some issues with white box CPEs. This sounds fairly easy to do, but white box CPEs are relatively expensive, particularly in comparison to the classical CPEs that they have been deploying for enterprise services. There are service migration issues, as well as what to do with legacy support, particularly in Europe. There's a lot of DSL, and across the world there are TDM and analog connections that need to be binded into the network. And remember, it's IDEX that are really focusing very much on NFV, and they have the most legacy to deal with. So the attraction of all VNS in the data center, the next slide, is that it really gives the operators a maximum amount of flexibility. They can deploy the functions inside their data centers, they can distribute them, they can achieve service elasticity, they can make efficient use of the compute and storage resources available to them. And if something does go wrong, then they can get there and send their experts fairly quickly. But there are a number of issues that they need to address. So, if you centralize everything, particularly routing protocols and some other network functions, then latency can be a big issue. What this has meant is that the operators are looking at building a distributed data center model, so at choosing various POPs around the network. I've heard figures between 6 and 50 super POPs being engineered by some of the operators in order to address the latency issue and also make sure that traffic is steered correctly and that they have the capacity to steer that traffic. But those data centers are expensive to build. Need to put a lot more equipment in place to the compute and storage resources, and they need to put in place a lot of software to drive that. Even if some of it's open source, there's a lot of cost issues associated with that. And in particular, a lot of the VNFs were designed to go on server appliances. So the architects of those products basically designed for performance, they designed for functionality, and they more or less said it doesn't really matter what the compute requirements are. But if you want to scale up, that can be a major, major issue. And high-density scalability really is a big, big problem. It's quite difficult for enterprise services. It's even more so for residential when, depending on the region, there are tens of millions of retail customers to deal with. And their preferred hosting platform for these VMs is OpenStack. And OpenStack has been widely criticized by the operators as not yet being ready for real-time deployment. A wide range of issues have been highlighted there, particularly by BT in the UK. So those are some of the issues around centralized model. And to be honest, although the operators are focusing on that model and trying to solve some of those issues, their actual initial area of focus is CPE deployment. So the white box CPE is attractive to them because they can fully abstract the software and achieve hardware dependency. This is one of the initial goals of NFV. They don't have to deal with the complex, monolithic, as they call them, hardware architectures of the vendors. They can drop and deploy automatically VNS on this white box CPE. And many VNS belong on premises anyway. Particularly for North America, one of the goals of the white box CPE is to increase wallet share at enterprises. A lot of enterprises, particularly the larger ones in North America, have DIY networks, and the operators are hoping that by delivering this white box CPE model, first of all they can deliver the hardware platform onto which those VNS are loaded, and hopefully provide some of the actual VNS as a managed service. But their real target is appliance consolidation. They're targeting enterprise customers that have a lot of network equipment on their prem. So this could be a next-generation firewall, it could be a WAN optimization appliance, it could be a load balancer, as well as the router. And they believe it's a deployable model today. And by and large, they are correct. There are some issues that surround the white box CPE. Not least is this issue of cost. The white box CPE is based on Intel processors. Intel has a monopoly in this marketplace. And although they're working hard to increase performance for their CPUs for this market, it's still a relatively low volume market for them. And until the ARM vendors come on board, there's no real competition for them. So we're seeing ratios of 2, 3, or even higher compared to a classical CPE in terms of price. And that's why the operators, at least initially, are focusing on appliance consolidation, because they can see the ROI from that. They have legacy considerations to address. A white box, almost by definition, has Ethernet connections, but not DSL, certainly not LTE. And LTE is becoming increasingly important as providing a major resiliency function for enterprise services that are based in the cloud. And then one of the premises of NFV is that you can choose to add functions when and as you need them. But it also means that the compute and storage and memory resources to host those functions need to be available in advance. So actually you have to over-provision the white box CPE vis-a-vis a classical CPE in order to be able to have that flexibility. As I said, as in the data center, the resource consumption of some of the major VNS is a problem for them. They're having to use multi-core technology from Intel, almost the base white box CPE platform that's being considered by most of the operators has at least 8 cores, and they're looking at 16 and 32 core models to accommodate some of that. And then, of course, if it's on the prem, they need to troubleshoot it. This is new technology, it's complex technology, and the maturity of some of those tools is not quite what they would desire. So those are some of the issues from the purer approaches, and I think the operators will get there eventually, but it is a work in progress. And as we'll see in a minute, they're looking at a various range of options in order to get them to virtualization more quickly, bearing in mind some of these cost, complexity, and other issues that they have to address. So if we look at what's happening in the operators today, appliance consolidation is the main focus. If you consolidate several expensive appliances onto a white box, then the cost of the white box is less relevant. But if you want to use a white box CP for the volume end of the marketplace, then price becomes a big constraint. The white box CPs are relatively early market products. So it's not so much that they're not functional enough. It is that the operators are taking quite a while to onboard them and integrate them into their IT systems. So what they have done in order to get to market relatively quickly is to use a so-called grey box. This is a box that has a typical network processor for the routing functions and some other network functions, but also has an x86 compute platform either as a blade or integrated into the product so that they can host DNS. And the initial focus, given this trend towards appliance consolidation, at least in the early days, is on existing network functions. As I said, the centralized model is very much a work in progress. The operators do have quite ambitious plans to build out these data centers, but they haven't yet really got any of these data centers to work as yet, and very few services have launched. So what this all means is that pragmatism has really become the new watchword. Yeah? Only launch it if it makes economic sense. Appliance consolidation clearly makes economic sense. Launch what is available. The one thing you have to consider is it still, although the ambition of NFV is to onboard new services more quickly, in this early stage of the technology, it's still quite a forklift for them to bring in new boxes, new DNS, and so forth. But they will move to the purer models when available.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, Praveen. So for everyone in the audience, we're just moving to our first poll question of the session. Here, it would be very interesting if we could get your perspective on the following question, which is, when do you expect operators in your market to offer enterprise services using virtual CPE? Within that, we've obviously got a fairly broad definition of vCPE there, whether it's grey box, white box, centralized, or whatever. Just click the appropriate radio button on your screen, and I'll push the results out in a moment. Before I do that, and while everyone is having a chance to vote, perhaps a question or two for Praveen. And by the way, you can submit questions at any time during the event via the Q&A tab on your screen. And where appropriate, I'll try and work them in. If not, we'll get to them toward the end. Praveen, I feel like I should sort of jump straight in on the cost point issue that you raised a few times, but I know we have some material on that coming up. So we'll leave that just for the moment. But you mentioned North America, particularly interested in appliance consolidation on-prem. What kind of geographic variation do you see, in terms of preferences for different models and reasons for it, whether it's Europe or North America?
Well, I think, as I already mentioned, North America has a lot of large enterprise customers that build and manage their own networks. The operators refer to it as DIY networks, and they see an opportunity to build wallet share by providing more flexible services to those enterprises using white box. I think also North American customers have been more willing to invest in a number of appliances on their premises than is typically seen in Europe. Europe clearly was in the vanguard of delivering managed services. There's much wider acceptance in Europe of buying all of the enterprise services as a package or bundle from the operators. And typically this has been delivered using one CPE, the router CPE, but with embedded services on it. So the economic drivers are less attractive in Europe. It doesn't mean that we don't see the same thing in Europe, large enterprise customers with DIY networks, with lots of appliances, but it's a rarer beast than is typically found in North America. I think also there's a little bit of a competition going on between Verizon and AT&T to get out there first. As we know, AT&T's made a lot of noise in the press and at conferences about their Domain 2.0 program. Verizon has been slightly less noisy, but is focusing more pragmatically on just getting it to work and getting out there with services for their customers. I think that's another driver.
Yeah, okay. Nothing wrong with a good dose of competition in my book. Thanks. That was a really good response to the poll. So I'm going to push the results out now. And here they are. We have 6% of the audience respondents saying VCP is already available in their market, 33% saying planning to deploy within 12 months, 27% within 2 years, 29% not sure, and 6% no. Praveen, how would you interpret that?
I think that's pretty much where the operators are. I think there are big regional variations, and I think there are variations between the operators. Coming back to North America, I think Verizon and AT&T are very much in the vanguard. And a lot of the industry, not just in North America, is sort of waiting to see what happens. Is it successful? Do they resolve some of the complexity issues before they embark on this themselves? So I think it really depends on the region and the operator as to whether or not this would be true. But broadly, I think it's about correct.
Yeah, okay, good stuff. Okay, with that, the thing that points out to me is, yes, there is definitely some near-term action, but also something that will, across the market, roll out over a period of years rather than in one big bang. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to you, Praveen, for the next part of the session. A reminder to the audience: please do submit your questions.
But bearing in mind what I said is the centralized model is very much a work in progress. Really, a lot of work is being done by the operators on CPE deployment models. They genuinely believe they can get this to work, and this is where their initial service launches are mostly focused, not exclusively, but mostly focused. And there's a lot of activity on their part, RFIs, RFPs, lab trials, and indeed some initial service launches using these models. So I'm going to discuss 6 different CPE deployment models. On the left, the single CPE deployment model, and I'll go into the details of these different things. I've talked a little bit about grey box and white box already, but I'll focus in on that, as well as the NetConf-enabled classical CPE, and something called a thin CPE in the industry. There is an interesting development that we have seen, which is so-called, what I call sidecar deployment. This is really 2 boxes. And what it means is, certainly for the slim box, this is really to address cost issues, and we'll see why in a minute. And then the NetConf-enabled voice gateway is very much to address the issues of TDM and analog connections that are required on customer premises. So let's dig into these. So the NetConf-enabled classical CPE is there to address cost issues. A classical CPE, whether or not it speaks NFV or not, has a certain price point, which is well below that of a white box CPE. And also the operators are very conscious that they can't do this all in one go. They have to keep on generating their normal enterprise services. They'll be migrating their enterprise customers over several years. But what the NetConf-enabled classical CPE does is it can speak 2 or 3 different provisioning languages. So it can speak CLI and TR69 in terms of provisioning, but also NetConf Yang. And so this means that if they commit to the purchase of a classical CPE that speaks NetConf, they can move at their own pace. The other thing about the classical CPE is it already has DSL and LTE connectivity on it. Embedded into the box, cost optimized. They don't have to look at some of the add-ons they would need to do for a white box to do this. So it really provides a practical solution for this. But in terms of CPE procurement activities by the operators, they're really looking to get this type of approach from their equipment vendors. and some of the vendors have responded. I talked a little bit about the grey box CPE. This is what I call the early bird launch. It's quite an expensive deployment model, but it allows them to get there quickly, test some of the provisioning methods, test the loading of VNFs, typically from vendors that are already integrated into the IT systems, so the onboarding cost and time is less. But on that box, you have a mix of PNS and VNS. PNS are physical network functions that are embedded inside the box and run on the network processor. Then there's a separate compute platform that provides the hosting environment for VNS. They get a mix of the two worlds here. But there is a big but. This is quite costly. But some operators have gone down this route, as I said, to get their toe in the water in particular, but also to make sure that they claim that they are launching NFV services. AT&T has made some public announcements on this, perhaps obscuring the fact that they're using grey boxes, if I can say that, and Verizon as well. The white box CPE, this is where the software is fully abstracted. Yeah, the VNFs are all dynamically loaded, and as I've already discussed, they're expensive. Not just because they're more expensive for the same processing power than a classical CPE, but also because the VNFs themselves are quite heavy in terms of their processing, memory, and storage requirements. There is a move on the part of Intel to respond to this. They have shared with the industry a lot of information about a new Denverton family of CPUs, which, although it won't necessarily lower the price of the CPU itself, it will address some of the performance issues that are needed to run some of these larger VNS. So watch this space for Denverton as products start to appear on the market, probably in Q2 or Q3 of next year.
Just to interrupt you quickly there, Praveen. You mentioned a couple of times ARM. Are there any kind of, what do you see in terms of supply chain, in terms of ARM-based product here?
Well, there are in particular two ARM vendors that are looking at this very actively. So this is Avago, in particular the Broadcom arm of Avago, and also NXP, which is a European-based chip vendor. They're very anxious to be able to provide products to the marketplace. They believe that Intel's pricing strategy gives them the opportunity to get market share if they can deliver white box CPE based on ARM in particular. The issue that the industry is facing is you need a lot of things to happen in parallel for the ARM solution to come to market. And I've had extensive conversations with both operators and these two chip vendors on this. You need, obviously, the VNF vendors to compile their VNFs and run them on ARM. And by and large, that's not that difficult to do. And I know that they're providing APIs that look and smell like Intel to facilitate that process. So, for instance, DPDK, which is one of the primary acceleration mechanisms within some of the Intel chips, they're providing an API that looks like DPDK. In fact, they're calling it DPDK. The underlying acceleration engine is different, but the API to access it is very similar, if not identical. So you need the VNF vendors to support it. You need an operator to commit. In a lot of the RFIs and RFPs that I see, there's what I call a curiosity question, which says, do you have any plans for ARM? If so, where are you? But there hasn't yet been a push by the major operators to use ARM. And I think the ARM vendors need that to happen before that solution can come to marketplace. I've heard rumors that in Japan, one of the operators there is looking at providing public support for ARM. But it's certainly in Europe and in North America, it's still in the curiosity phase, I would say. And at the moment, it's mostly focused on the CPE, not so much on the data center. And there is a different approach here between the two vendors. So Avago Broadcom is looking to attack both CPE and server, whereas NXP is looking to focus mostly on the CPE end of the market.
Okay, thanks. NXP, of course, in the news quite a bit this week. Okay, back to you, Pravin.
Okay. So let's look at the CPE. I remember in one of my very first conversations with an operator in North America, I said, what do you think the CPE of the future is going to look like? And he said, a hole in the wall. Yeah, an Ethernet socket, basically. I think he was being slightly optimistic. But there is this viewpoint that if you centralize all the DNS, then you really need not much more than a modem with certain microservices on it, in particular for tunneling to provide overlay, to be able to get the traffic to go to that centralized DNS. There's a lot of interest in this for the residential, and there are some architectural initiatives undergoing to be able to provide and define how that actually happens. And there's also interest for the business Ethernet market. Business Ethernet or Ethernet access devices are relatively, I wouldn't call them simple devices, but they don't provide all the functionality that a typical router would do. And obviously here the VNS are located in the data center. As I said, quite a lot of issues to get through before this really becomes a realistic deployment model. But although it's not yet being deployed by and large, there is quite a lot of work going on to try and resolve issues. So let's take a look at these sidecar models. So about 2 years ago, I sensed that the market would go more towards a single box, a sort of grey box if you like, the grey part of the box doing the voice and analog connectivity, and then x86 inside the same box. But then I think, in this drive to try and achieve a purer model, the operators have actually separated the two. So they want to deploy a white box. Remember, not all of their customers have legacy issues to deal with. And then provide a separate box that has lots of TDM, T1, ISDN, PRI, that type of thing, as well as analog connectivity. Now, what they want this voice gateway to do is also speak netconf, so they have a common management interface. So this box would plug into, via an Ethernet port typically, into the white box, do all the TDM and analog connectivity, the conversion to SIP typically, if required. And this is proving to be very attractive to the operators. We're seeing a lot of interest in it. Now, this other sidecar model bears just a little bit of analysis, and it really comes down to cost. The operators are saying to themselves, and there's some regional variation here, that, okay, we have VNS, we put them into our catalog, we make them available via a self-service portal, etc., etc. But how many customers are actually going to choose them? And should I equip my whole install base with white boxes in order to accommodate what could be as little as 10 or 20% of their customers? So the idea here, and I think we're seeing a lot of interest in Europe for this type of model, is that they use a classical CPE, physical CPE if you like, that does DSL, and DSL is widely spread here in Europe. And then for those customers that do choose or elect to use VNS, they send them a slim white box, relatively cost effective, where they can put 1 or 2 medium VNS. So it's really directed at the volume end of the market, trying to address some of the cost issues there. Same thing, both boxes are netconf enabled, with a common management interface. And interestingly, this also solves some of the LTE issue in order to provide resiliency. And obviously, they can extend this with additional DNFs in the data center when ready. There is a slight difference between.
Oh, so just before we go on, what on your previous slide there, I was wondering if you could give us a sense of, which types of services or VNFs would trigger a sidecar deployment of a slim white box here. What is?
The operators are still debating that themselves, but I sense it's going to be a relatively lightweight firewall for SMB customers. There is some interest in having a wireless access controller running on this type of box, and also a virtual SBC. Those are the ones that sort of come up the most in our discussions. I have to say this is a relatively early stage, this deployment model, but we are seeing interest from operators, particularly in Europe, to do this, because it really addresses a lot of problems for them, DSL and LTE. Only a small percentage of their customers will take up this, and it addresses their critical cost issue as well.
Yeah. And the number, you say you can run one or two sort of VNFs on that low cost product.
Yes.
Is there sort of any prospect? I think you mentioned as well that quite a few of the VNFs are relatively heavyweight, perhaps relative to what they could be. Is there any sense that you would expect to see the VNFs be, as it were, slimmed down or redesigned to like either improve performance on the constrained resource or be able to run more VNFs on that resource? Is there a big effort from VNF vendors to do that, I guess, is the question.
To be honest, I've heard rumours. Obviously, I'm not one of those VNF vendors that have that problem. But I have heard some echoes that there is some effort in this direction. But I think it's a major task. It means that the product has to be completely re-engineered, not just to address the architectural issues that require so much memory and storage, but also to implement the Yang models and all the things that are inside that VNF. So it's a major undertaking, I think, for the vendors. So I think in the long term, probably that will be solved. But when I say the long term, I'm thinking this is probably a 5, possibly 10-year journey.
Okay, got you. Okay, thanks.
But just as a side note here, in terms of the two different models, sidecar routing is different depending on the sidecar model employed. So if you have a physical CP, as you would expect, the routing is inside the box. And then the VNFs are associated with the box, which does the routing and the tunneling, if you like, set up service chain for the VNF. In the white box, the VCP or vRouter would be resident there, and then they would set up the tunneling for the voice connections that are required using this NetConf-enabled voice gateway. There are slight differences there in how this is actually implemented. And the theme is common, 2 boxes, common management interface to address either cost or legacy.
Mm-hmm. Do you get any sense of which of those two is preferable, or are you just feeling your way and sort of letting the market tell you?
We're seeing a lot of interest in the NetConf-enabled voice gateway. We've seen commitments from operators to that model.
Just push it back a slide. That's the bottom one, right?
The bottom one.
Yeah, okay.
Certainly we have signed up a major operator to deliver that type of box. The slim white box is, I think, as I said, it's happening here in Europe. There is some hesitation in Europe for a multiplicity of reasons. One is they want to see what happens in North America first before they embark too quickly on deploying NFV like this. I think they're still struggling with some of the ROI issues. As we've discussed, they're still struggling. What are the VNFs that they can market to the volume end of the market, typically the SMB or the multi-site enterprise market. There's still a lot to be decided there in terms of market strategy, in terms of some of these complexity issues. But the NetConf-enabled voice gateway seems to be pretty much a no-brainer in terms of we have to do it. So yes, if somebody can give me a voice gateway that speaks NetConf, then I've got a solution.
Okay, good stuff. All right, back to where you were.
Yeah, so my last slide is really just giving you some parting thoughts about NFV and the migration to NFV. You know, it's not greenfield, this stuff. You really have to think about how you do this. There's a lot of, as I've mentioned, a lot of DSL copper and LTE connections that need to be bound into this NFV architecture. There are TDM and analog legacy connections. And then there is the equipment refresh cycle. You know, if you've just bought a bunch of CPE from a particular vendor, you don't want to throw it away after 18 months or even after 2 years. You've got to plan how to do that so that when you do make the investments, they're done when you would do them anyway. They may be slightly different investments, but they're done when you would do them anyway. So a key point that the operator is looking at is avoiding vendor lock-in. This is, I know some of the larger equipment vendors with big brand names are promoting end-to-end solutions. This is really complex. We can do it all for you. Turnkey system, don't worry, Mr. Operator. And certainly the larger operators are actively resisting that approach and trying to keep control of their NFV deployments themselves. And they're using one way to control the timing is joint support for NetConf Yang and classical CLI and TR69. Not just on the CPE, but also they're mandating some of the orchestrators to actually also support legacy equipment using CLI or TR69. We talked a lot about economic pragmatism. The white box is 2 or 3 times the cost of a classical CPE. So a lot of different models being looked at to try and address some of those issues, as well as the timing of migration. And I think the other parting thought is that, you know, there's no one approach, even within a single operator. They will use a multiplicity of approaches depending on the market segment, depending on their equipment refresh cycles, how much legacy they need to support, etc. So they're all wrestling with these issues. Not all of the answers are known, but what you can identify is some of the issues that are either breaking the deployment of NFV in terms of scalability in the center, the different options to address legacy and cost, the customer prem. So with that, that's really the end of my thoughts on this. We're active with a lot of operators around the industry in this, really at the coalface, and trying to come up with different models that allow them to choose the deployment option that makes sense for them.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, Praveen. We're going to go to our second poll question now, just before we go to the Q&A. So if you do have any questions, now's a great time to submit them, and we'll get onto that in just a moment. In the meantime, our poll question here we're asking, outside of the mainstream VNFs, which of the following VNFs are most important to service providers and enterprises, by implication, to deploy on VCPE? Do you think wireless access controllers, SBCs, VPNs, or analytics for business intelligence? If you could take a moment or two to fill that in, I'd be very appreciative again. And while people are doing that, I had a couple questions in. I think you've kind of talked about this a bit, Praveen, but we have a question from a European operator here. Why is a white box 2 to 3 times more expensive than a physical CPE, you know, a dedicated CPE? Is it basically down to the chipset, or are there other factors?
It's a combination of the chipset, the memory requirements, which are quite high, to support the VNFs, and storage. A lot of the operators would want to support the WAN optimization use case, and WAN optimization controllers tend to require a lot of storage. So what we're seeing is that they're choosing sort of different models. It's almost like T-shirt sizes: small, medium, large, extra large in terms of specifying the resources. But it seems, at least in this initial drive to appliance consolidation, that it's got to support WAN optimization, and that's a pretty heavy-duty VNF. It's also down to the CPU. The CPU from Intel is maybe not an order of magnitude more expensive than the network processors, but it's, we're talking 300 or 400% more expensive than a typical network processor.
Got it. Okay. I'm going to push out the results here. Quite an interesting breakout. 18% wireless access controller, 18% SBC, 38%. The biggest result here is for VPN. Notice we have an abbreviation within an abbreviation here with VVPN. And business intelligence analytics at 27%. Praveen, spare a thought on that for us?
I'm a little bit surprised that business intelligence analytics is so high. Porter has said that. But I wanted to ask it because we've had various suggestions more from system integrators than operators. This would be a good thing to have. Otherwise, yes, that more or less aligns with what I'm seeing in the marketplace. I know the operators are focusing on all of these things. I would have expected DSBC to be slightly higher than it is here, but no huge surprises.
Yeah. Okay. All right, good stuff. So let's go to some questions. I have a few pre-prepared, and we have a few in from the audience already. So I'll go with this one first, actually, because it's one that relatively simple. But how much of the market, roughly speaking, an approximation, do you think or requires a DSL or LTE compatibility in the on-prem device? Is that a majority, or is that a niche requirement? And I guess
certainly in Europe, it's close to being a majority requirement. I think all of the operators have large copper install bases. They're in the process of rolling out VDSL. Some are looking at bonded VDSL, and there's still quite a lot of SHDSL out there. So certainly in Europe, it's a majority requirement. Again, slight regional fluctuations, a bit more fibre in the north. I know in France there's a big drive to deliver fibre, as there is in the UK. I think DSL is less prominent in the States. So okay. I wouldn't call it niche, but it's minority.
Yeah. Okay. What's the role of LTE here? Is this for like very small branch office, or for failover, or what's the role of LTE in these devices?
Well, there are several drivers for LTE. We do see on some remote sites that LTE is more cost effective than pushing a DSL or a fibre connection. So there it's a primary connectivity method. But I think the biggest one is failover. If you have everything in the cloud, if your main link goes down, you still need to be able to get to those cloud-based services. And so LTE, because it provides broadband-like transmission speeds, is being looked at much more actively than 3G was in the past. Also, some of the operators are concerned about revenue leakage. If it takes them a long time to get a fixed circuit to a customer, they risk losing that customer. So what they will do is they'll provide an LTE and a fixed WAN device with the two WAN connections, immediately, get the customer up and running on LTE, and then as the fixed line becomes available, then they move them over to the fixed line, and then relegate the LTE, if you like, to failover. And then a possible minority case is where you bond the two together. So we see some interest, certainly in Europe, to have, to try and meet certain regulatory requirements in terms of broadband speed for X% of the population. There is some interest in bonding lower speed DSL connections with 4G to try and hit those performance targets.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's the sort of cost impact of LTE in a device?
It's a concern, but by and large, people are buying the LTE as long as it's relatively attractively priced. A lot of customers have actually got two boxes. Yeah, they have one piece of connectivity with a fixed line circuit, and then they're using another box from another vendor to provide the LTE if that goes down. But there are some attractions to having it all integrated in one box. Yeah, US parameters and that type of thing.
Yeah, okay. Another question. You mentioned obviously NetConf quite a bit all the way through. I assume that's pretty much a hard requirement now. I was wondering, two things really. Are there any substantive differences in vendor implementations in how they support NetConf? But actually, I suppose more likely to see variation will be in the use of Yang models for service orchestration, which I understand to be a lot more variation there.
Yeah, so I think I can confirm, NetConf Yang is pretty much a hard requirement by the operators. There's still some interest in open flow, but more in the data center than out to the customer prem. Yes, there are some standardization efforts to try and define standardized Yang models, but it's still pretty early stage. So most of the vendors are building their own Yang models and then making commitments to the operators to standardize them once the standard becomes available. That does create occasionally name conflict issues. We have seen that on a couple of instances. Usually they can be quickly resolved. So it's not a major headache, but standardization takes a while.
Okay, good stuff. So just before, we're going to take a couple more questions, but just while we do that, I've pushed our audience evaluation form to your screens. If you could fill that in as we finish, that would be great, and I can assure you we look at all the responses we get and pay attention to them, so it's not an effort in vain. So yeah, time for a couple more questions. Praveen, could you talk about the state of interop between VNFs and white box CPE? How much interop testing does the operator need to do?
It's one of their areas of focus. Actually getting the interoperability on the white box is not that difficult to achieve. Yeah, the VNFs are being relatively well implemented. The process of providing connectivity between the VNFs in order to enable service chaining is also relatively well understood. There is a question of what happens if something goes wrong. This comes back to troubleshooting. There's a lack of troubleshooting tools. That's something the industry needs to address, particularly for white CPE. It's remote, so the troubleshooting tools need to provide those remote diagnostics if there's a significant issue. But interoperability seems to be working quite well. It's up and running in days rather than weeks in most cases. What the operators are focusing more on now is getting service assurance. They want to be able to deliver SLAs to their customers, and so that seems to be the major focus. Doesn't mean there aren't issues. There are some, but they're getting broadly solved pretty quickly.
Okay, good. And then maybe, as we're coming towards the end here, maybe to sort of look a bit further ahead, into your sort of crystal ball, as it were. Do you think the sort of centralized model will ever work? By ever, I mean kind of, within some sort of foreseeable time frame.
I think it will, more for certain parts of the market than others. I think the centralized model is well adapted to the residential market. In fact, a lot of residential services today are already centralized, maybe not in the virtualized manner that the operators would like to see. And as I said, for the business Ethernet market. But there's still a lot that needs to happen on the customer prem. There's a lot of interest in hybrid WAN type deployments. What do you do about the security when you've got direct internet connections on the branch or the customer premises site? That's something that needs to be done. There's the legacy stuff. There you can put a VSPC into a centralized model, but then you lose survivability if the connection goes down. By that I mean local survivability, so calls between phones on the site. There is resiliency, which is that if the main connection goes down, you want to be able to go to another connection. So there's still quite a lot of functionality that I think naturally belongs on the prem. So I think long term it will be a mixed deployment approach where residential and maybe business Ethernet takes a more centralized approach. But I think for the majority of enterprise services, you'll still see VNFs on the customer prem. And then the interesting question that some of the operators are saying, well, if I have to put a white box down there for on-prem VNFs, why am I building these expensive data centers, centralized VNFs? But that's more of a philosophical question than that some are posing. But I think it'll be a mix. You put the VNF where it makes sense.
Okay, good stuff. On the mixture of a philosophical and a practical note, I'm going to close the call now. I'd like to finish by first of all thanking Praveen Mirchandani from One Access for today's session. Thanks very much, Praveen.
Thank you, Gabriel.
And finally, I'd just like to thank everybody in the audience for attending and participating today.